In 1961, a group of young activists boarded interstate buses in Washington with a simple goal: test whether segregation on interstate travel was actually illegal. On paper, it already was. The Supreme Court had ruled that segregated interstate bus terminals were unconstitutional. But once riders crossed into the Deep South, federal law seemed to disappear. And that was the real purpose of the Freedom Rides. Not just to challenge segregation, but to expose a country where the meaning of law changed depending on where you were standing.
We were called a variety of things. We were the Freedom Riders. And this is how the Freedom Rides began.
To understand the Freedom Rides, you have to understand the geography of the United States in 1961, because legally, the country was not operating as one unified system. The federal government in Washington had already issued rulings against segregation in interstate travel. In Morgan v. Virginia, the Supreme Court had ruled that segregated seating on interstate buses was unconstitutional. Then, in Boynton v. Virginia, the court expanded that protection to include terminals, waiting rooms, and restaurants serving interstate passengers. But those rulings depended on enforcement, and in much of the South, local authorities simply ignored the rulings. This is where the concept of federalism becomes important. Federalism is the division of power between national and state governments. But during the Civil Rights Movement, federalism became geographic. The authority of federal law weakened the further activists moved into the Deep South, where local governments, police departments, and segregationist officials often operated as if Supreme Court rulings did not apply to them. That was exactly what the Freedom Riders intended to expose. The rides were organized primarily by Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. The plan was carefully designed. Riders would travel from Washington, D.C. through Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi before ending in New Orleans. The route mattered. The riders intentionally moved deeper into the regions where segregation was strongest because they understood something crucial. A right that only exists in certain places is not fully a right at all. And by physically crossing state lines together, black and white riders forced the contradiction into public view. The interstate highway system became a test whether the federal government actually controlled its own map.
We're dedicated to this. We'll take hitting, we'll take beating. We're willing to accept death.
As the buses moved south, the violence escalated. The Freedom Rides became a journey through the most entrenched segregationist regions of the Deep South, especially in Alabama and Mississippi. And on May 14, 1961, Mother's Day, the ride turned deadly. Near the city of Anniston, a mob attacked a Greyhound bus carrying Freedom Riders. The tires were slashed, the bus was firebombed, and riders were trapped inside as the crowd attempted to keep the doors shut. Later that same day, another group of riders arriving in Birmingham was beaten by a mob that had effectively been given permission by Commissioner Bull Connor to attack without police interference. The violence was so severe that CORE initially considered ending the rides entirely, but students from Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, refused to let that happen. Led in part by Diane Nash, activists from Nashville traveled to Birmingham to continue the rides, because they understood the stakes. If violence could stop the movement, then violence could override federal law itself. This is where the concept of regionalism becomes important. Regionalism refers to the way regions develop distinct political, cultural, and social identities. And in the Deep South of 1961, segregation was not just a collection of laws. It was a regional system enforced through local governments, police departments, customs, and violence. The Freedom Riders were not simply moving through space, they were moving through competing political geographies. And the further south they traveled, the more dangerous that geography became. The Freedom Rides created a crisis the federal government could no longer ignore. Because the violence was not happening in isolated towns. It was happening on interstate routes, in bus terminals, and at transportation hubs connected directly to federal commerce. And at the height of the Cold War, that became an international embarrassment for the United States. Images of burning buses and bloodied riders spread around the world. Soviet propaganda used the violence to challenge American claims about democracy and freedom. This geography of segregation had become a geopolitical problem. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy eventually pressured the Interstate Commerce Commission to issue a stronger and enforceable ruling against segregation in interstate travel facilities. On September 22, 1961, the ICC issued new regulations banning segregation in interstate bus and train terminals. The order officially took effect on November 1st. Signs marked white and colored began disappearing from interstate transit spaces across the South. And this is where the final geographic concept matters: networks. A network is a system of interconnected routes, locations, and flows that link places together. The Freedom Riders understood that interstate transportation was one of the most important networks in America. By targeting bus routes and terminals, they forced the federal government to confront segregation at the points where state systems connected to the nation as a whole. More than 400 riders participated in at least 60 different Freedom Rides throughout 1961. Many adopted a strategy of jail, no bail, intentionally overwhelming local prison systems in places like Mississippi. They used movement itself as a weapon. because the writers understood something simple. If Americans could not move freely across their own country, then the country was not truly unified. The freedom rides were never just about buses. They were about geography, about what it means when the protection of law changes from one state to another, about what happens when a country claims to be unified but its roads tell a different story. The riders did not carry weapons, they did not hold political office, and most were barely in their 20s. But they understood that movement was power, and by crossing state lines together, they exposed the contradiction at the center of the United States. A nation cannot claim to believe in equality if equality disappears at its borders. The Freedom Riders forced America to redraw its map, not with ink, but by refusing to stop moving forward.